Welcome to On the Money Line, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsome, and I'm here to break down UFC Vegas 73. We're back at the Apex, this time headlined by a 5-round fight between Mackenzie Dern and Angela Hill. Just before we get into the breakdowns though, as always, there's going to be a Base AI recap from last weekend's event at UFC Charlotte, where I talk about the UFC prediction software, the results, what it predicted, what rounds it predicted, methods of victory, where the value was, where the underdogs were, and also provide a little bit of education surrounding the AI as well. So if you're interested in the AI and the prediction software that we run here at MMA Play 365, then make sure you check that out. That'll be on its own YouTube playlist and our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/MMA Play 365. So now, without any further ado, we're going to get straight into the breakdowns, and we start with that main event between Mackenzie Dern and Angela Hill. Now, this is a fight that should have happened, I believe it was last week or maybe the week before. I have actually done a breakdown on this fight as well, but this event at UFC Vegas 73 needed a main event, so the UFC upgraded Mackenzie Dern and Angela Hill to this main event. Now, although I don't hate the main event, I do think the UFC could have done a little bit better, because I actually don't think that the extra 2 rounds is going to favour either fighter in an extreme way here. Like, for me, Mackenzie Dern, the extra 2 rounds just means she's got an extra 2 rounds to try and get the fight down to the mat if she is struggling. You know, Angela Hill can be difficult with that takedown defense sometimes, and that extra 2 rounds for Dern will allow her to pursue that game plan a little bit more and try and get the fight down to the mat. But for Angela Hill, if she is defending the takedowns, then it just gives Angela Hill an extra couple of rounds to piece Mackenzie Dern up, frustrate her, slow her down. So for me, I think there's advantages on both sides for both women here in regards to the 5 rounds. So it's not as if, what I'm trying to say, it's not as if the UFC really wanted to find out which fighter has that championship potential, for example. Like, you know, like they did with Belal Muhammad and Gilbert Burns, they give those the extra 2 rounds just to find out who is more suited for that 5-round title fight. And for me, Mackenzie Dern, we've seen her go 5 rounds before, and we've seen Angela Hill go 5 rounds as well. So I don't think that the extra couple of rounds has a massive benefit on one particular side in this fight. But look, I've broken this fight down before on a previous podcast. I'm going to break it down again, but the breakdown's not really going to change too much. I think obviously if this is now a 25-minute kickboxing fight, then Angela Hill's going to piece Mackenzie Dern up. But if it is a true MMA fight, and we do see moments of good wrestling and top side control and the grappling game being worked as well, then obviously that's going to favour Mackenzie Dern's side. And that's the side I am going to be leaning with, because I do think that we are going to see a mixture of martial arts in this fight. I do think that Angela Hill's going to start pulling away with the striking whilst it's on the feet. But for me, that's only going to make Mackenzie Dern be more urgent to take her down. And I think Dern's going to be urgent enough to take her down. But if she's then starting to get hit more than she likes, and a corner are telling her that she needs to, you know, up the game plan, work towards it, otherwise she's going to start falling behind, then I think that's going to, like I've already said, just add to that urgency of Dern getting the fight down to the mat. And the thing is, Angela Hill does have good takedown defense, but at the same time, she can be taken down, and I think Mackenzie Dern will be able to exploit that takedown defense. I do think that Dern can get Angela Hill down. I think Hill, for the most part, within the first couple of takedowns, I think she'll probably be okay. She might even be able to stand up back to her feet. But I do think that if Dern does continuously take her down across these 5 rounds, that every takedown that she lands, she'll just have that little bit more success with than she did the time before. So I think that the fight is going to be very back and forth. I think there's going to be some rounds where we're talking about where the judges are going to be scoring it. Are the judges going to like the top game from Dern, or are they going to like the aggressive striking from Hill before those takedowns came? I think it's going to be one of those types of fights. But I do think, like I said, the longer the fight goes on, with every takedown that Dern lands, I think she's going to have just a little bit more top control time than she did the time before, and that should lead her to pulling away with the fight the longer it goes on. And we could potentially even see a late finish as well if there's enough top control time and Dern's working, you know, her submission magic. Because let's not forget, Mackenzie Dern is one of the most decorated Brazilian jiu-jitsu artists, not just in a division, but just in the entire UFC. Like, she is a very high-level black belt. So there's every chance that the longer that she's got to work on top of Angela Hill, the more opportunities she's going to have to finish as well. Obviously, like I said, if Dern isn't getting the takedowns, and Angela Hill is going to, I think, piece her up. But again, when you're looking at the striking, Dern's striking is on the level of Angela Hill's, but a striking is something that's developing. So I kind of think when you're looking at gapping skill as well, I think there's a bigger gapping skill in the jiu-jitsu of both women here than there is in the striking of both women. So I think Dern's a better striker than Angela Hill is a grappler. And again, that just points me towards the Mackenzie Dern win. So for those reasons, I'm picking Mackenzie Dern to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, we've got Edmen Shahbazyan versus Anthony Hernandez. And this is actually a really interesting fight. And to be honest with you, I kind of wish this had got the upgrade to the main event. I don't know whether the UFC had discussed it with both fighters. Maybe one of the fighters wasn't happy with taking the extra 2 rounds on short notice. I don't know. We've seen it happen before. But it's a real interesting fight. And Edmen Shahbazyan's currently sitting at like a plus 205 to plus 230 underdog. So the betting line on Edmen Shahbazyan is really, really good here. But with that type of betting line, you do then have to start asking the question, why is Edmen Shahbazyan that big of an underdog? And look, Anthony Hernandez seems to have turned a corner. Like when he came into the UFC, he was very hit and miss. He'd have some good performances, but then he'd have some lackluster performances as well. But then he'd be beating people that you would probably expect him to, go very close with at the least. But then he'd be losing against fighters that you'd be expecting him to beat. So with Anthony Hernandez over the last few fights, he really has turned that corner. He's becoming more consistent. He seems to have found his groove with the wrestling, and he's becoming relentless with the wrestling as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why the betting line's so high. Like a couple of fights ago, Anthony Hernandez, like I said, was relentless with that wrestling. And again, we didn't know whether that was going to be a one-off, whether that was just one of the the inconsistent performances, but then the fight after that, he goes relentless again. And now you can make that correct assumption that Anthony Hernandez has just found his way inside the cage. And if he does start shooting relentlessly here at Shahbazyan, then I do think it's going to be a long night for Shahbazyan. But again, it's like Shahbazyan can wrestle as well. And yes, he's been taken down. The likes of Derek Brunson was the first one that really exposed him. And I think Anthony Hernandez is going to be able to get takedowns as well. But if Shahbazyan remains scrappy, if he remains on point, if he's got that low stance, expecting the takedowns to come in from Hernandez and cracking Hernandez as he's coming in, because this is the other thing, Shahbazyan, in my opinion, has got better striking than Anthony Hernandez. So one of the best things that you can do, and there was a good example of this a couple of weeks ago when we had Dinar Bakgari versus Brady Heastand. So I bet Brady Heastand, but Dinar Bakgari's striking was that much better than Heastand's, that Heastand just couldn't find these entries into the takedowns. So I'm kind of thinking with Shahbazyan, can he adopt that same type of strategy where every time Hernandez comes in, he hits him with, even if it's just a jab, just to halt him and stop that forward movement, or just threatening the uppercuts and just landing strikes on him and forcing Hernandez backwards. If Shahbazyan can get Hernandez moving backwards, then it's going to be much more difficult for Hernandez to adopt this relentless wrestling strategy. And if he can't relentlessly wrestle Shahbazyan, I think this fight's going to be super close. And therefore, you've got a ton of value on the underdog in Shahbazyan. But the thing is, I have to go with what I see on tape. And the last couple of fights, Anthony Hernandez has not only been relentless with his wrestling, but he's been successful with that relentless wrestling. And he's also had really good topside control as well, threatening with submissions, good positional awareness, good fight IQ on the mat. And that's hard to ignore from a fighter that is just constantly shooting takedown after takedown after takedown. So I do think that Shahbazyan can be got at here. It's also an area, like I said, we've seen him exposed a little bit before. It's just that question that I'm asking is, can Shahbazyan striking be that good that forces Hernandez backwards and stops Hernandez from having that relentless game plan? It's a possibility. But I am going to be siding with the fighter that has been dominant lately, that's looked really phenomenal and has turned that corner. And like I said, has just shown real good fight IQ from knowing the game plan and being able to execute it. And even when things have gone a little bit against him, he's not deviated from that game plan and he's gone back at it again. And that fighter's Hernandez. So for those reasons, I'm picking Anthony Hernandez to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Emily Ducote versus Lupita Godinez. And this is an interesting fight. There's some pros and some cons on both sides here. I'm actually going to start with negatives. So for Ducote, one thing that I really don't like about her is the volume. I think she's really low volume. She can be a little too relaxed, a little too patient at times. And I just feel that a fighter that's got good forward pressure and a fighter that is not going to be backed up and will meet her in the middle is a fighter that's going to be able to beat her. And Godinez has some of those strengths within the weaknesses that I've just explained of Ducote. Now, from Lupita Godinez's side, I think we haven't seen too much of it, but I think there's going to be some inconsistencies within a performance. Like last time out against Cynthia Calvillo, that should have been a fight that Lupita Godinez got in on the hips, got the wrestling going, taking her down. She comes from not only a family of wrestlers, but a wrestling background herself as well. So I did genuinely think that Godinez should have taken Calvillo down. She should have got her down. She shouldn't have been too worried about the jiu-jitsu game because Godinez has got decent jiu-jitsu herself. But that's just not how that fight played out. And I think that Godinez had a good fight there to really express herself and show that she's a serious contender in the division. And sure, she did beat Calvillo, but it was much closer than it should have been. Then the fight before that, she lost to Angela Hill over a 3-round decision. Again, probably could have been there with the wrestling a little bit more, but she wasn't, and Angela Hill was able to beat her. So in the last 2 fights, I think Godinez hasn't shown the best of her ability, and that to me says there's inconsistencies within the performance. So there's the negatives for both sides. It's really hard to trust low volume, but then it's really hard to trust a fighter that's not performing to the best of the ability, and you're just asking that question, well, what fight will that best of the ability performances start showing back up again? And it could be this one for Godinez. Now, the good parts with both fighters, look, Ducote's really patient. She doesn't get stressed inside the cage. She's very accurate. She doesn't waste strikes. She's very good countering as well. So when her opponents come in at her, she'll just have that calm, non-erratic type of movement, like a bit of a Muay Thai base, and then she'll just fire at opponents as they're coming in. Whereas Godinez, like I've already touched upon, she can be relentless when it comes to the wrestling. She's got good forward pressure. She's got a good mentality for fighting, just getting in the face of her opponents, trying to overwhelm them and trying to bully them inside the cage. And I actually think both styles here complement each other because Ducote, like I said, she won't have that crazy forward pressure. She's got that Muay Thai base, which is calm, patient, non-erratic movement. That'll allow Godinez to come in at her, which is what Godinez wants to do, but that'll also allow Ducote to fire as Godinez is coming in. So I think both fighters really complement each other here in regards to the stylistic matchup. But I am going to be siding with the fighter that I just think is the better fighter, and eventually that form will come back where she's starting to look really good, and that's on the side of Godinez. I also think Godinez has got multiple paths to victory here because I think she can be extremely competitive with the striking, but when it gets to the wrestling and grappling, I think that she's got advantages there, especially the wrestling. I think that's also the biggest gap in skill as well, which is another area that I look for when I'm coming to make predictions for fights. So I do think Godinez is the slightly better mixed martial artist. I think she's got more ways to win. I think she's more well-rounded and got the slightly better skills in more of the areas, more of the disciplines within MMA. And she's also got the biggest gap in skill, in my opinion, with the wrestling as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Lupita Godinez to win this fight. And in the next fight, this one should be fun for as long as it lasts. We've got Andre Fialho versus Joaquin Buckley. Now, like I said, for as long as it lasts, it should be great. I do think it's going to be a firefight. I think both fighters hit hard. Both fighters like to land the knockout. And it wouldn't surprise me if we saw similar exchanges to what we saw of Brian Battle versus Gabe Green last weekend, where they just stand in the pocket and wing, and whichever fighter lands first wins. And that could be the type of fight that we have here. Both, like I said, both fighters are powerhouses. They hit hard, they kick hard, they like to be in the face of their opponent's forward pressure. So either one of two things is going to happen here. Either both of the fighters, Fialho and Buckley, are going to end up meeting inside the middle and exchanging because neither want to give up that backward movement, or one of them is going to give up the backwards movement, the other one's going to come forwards, and it's going to be a long night for the one moving backwards. Again, long night for as long as it lasts. I think that both scenarios favour one particular fighter here, and that fighter's Buckley. So I think that when they're firing in the middle, I think, like I said, Fialho's got hard punches himself, just like Buckley, but I think Buckley hits slightly harder. I also think Buckley is slightly faster as well, so with the punches and the exchanges, Buckley should be the one that's landing slightly more at a slightly higher clip. But then I also think Buckley's more durable as well. So again, that's not to say Buckley can't get knocked out. I just feel that Fialho has taken now a lot of damage in his last couple of fights, and I'm not sure how that's going to reflect again fighting another powerhouse here. So they're my concerns for Fialho. I think that if any fighter is moving backwards, I think again it's more likely to be Fialho, because Buckley, the durability normally plays a big factor in this. When both fighters are winging, one of them's slightly hurting the other one more than the other, that's going to lead the fighter that's getting slightly hurt to move backwards. I think Buckley, again, with the speed, it might overwhelm Fialho a little bit more than what Fialho can overwhelm Buckley. So again, I just feel that if both fighters are moving backwards, that's more likely to be Buckley being the one that advances, and therefore that's going to give him more opportunities to land the shots, land the harder shots. I also think Buckley's starting to round out a more technical side to his game as well. So although he does have these wild big power punches, I think he's starting to become a better technical fighter. I think if you're looking at mixing things up inside the cage, Buckley's the more likely fighter to shoot a takedown as well, in my opinion, again with the developments that he's been making as a fighter. So all in all, I think it is a good fight for Buckley. Fialho's got every chance of knocking him out, though. You just can't deny that the power in Fialho's hands isn't scary. But I think in a firefight, it goes to Buckley. I think from a technical aspect, it goes to Buckley. Mixing things up inside the cage, that's more likely to be Buckley as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Joaquin Buckley to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Michael Johnson versus Diego Ferreira. And this is a really good fight. I think that from a striking perspective, it's going to be ultra close as well. But from a striking perspective, I think the fight favours Michael Johnson. Now, it all depends on whether Diego Ferreira can take Michael Johnson down. If he can't, then it's going to be a close fight. I think that Johnson might end up just edging some of the rounds against Ferreira in that striking battle again if Ferreira can't take him down. But listen, Ferreira's a decent boxer. Like, he's got good hands, he's got good combinations. We've seen what he's done against fighters such as Taisumov, who was one of the most scariest strikers at the time in the UFC, and Diego Ferreira went in there and pieced him up. So it's not as if Ferreira can't be in there with big power punches and also strikers that have got a good technical aspect to the game as well. It's just where Diego Ferreira's best is within the jiu-jitsu. Like, he's a high-level black belt. So this is where the fight gets interesting. And it gets interesting because of the wrestling. Like, Diego Ferreira's a decent wrestler. He can score takedowns. But Michael Johnson's a very good defensive wrestler. So for Diego Ferreira to get the fight to where he's best and where I believe is the biggest gap in skill as well within the jiu-jitsu, it's going to be difficult because Michael Johnson, like I said, his takedown defenses and defensive wrestling aspect of his game is phenomenal. Now, if Diego Ferreira can get Johnson down, Johnson is in a world of trouble, and I'm not sure how long he survives on the mat with Ferreira, which does have to be taken into consideration. Look, I know Michael Johnson, like I've already mentioned a couple of times already, has got insane defensive wrestling, but it's just if that fight hits the mat, Diego Ferreira is just that much better than Johnson within the grappling and the jiu-jitsu. Diego Ferreira can be competitive with Johnson on the feet. It's more likely to be one of those very close split decision types of fights, or maybe one of those fights where we're just unsure how a couple of the rounds are scored, but then one fighter has a dominant round 3, for example, and then the first 2 we're talking about, well, which way do you score the first 2? It could be one of those fights from a striking perspective if the fight does play out for the most part on the feet. But if we're starting to mix takedowns in and topside control, then the fight heavily starts leaning over to Diego Ferreira. And although I do feel that we are going to see extended periods of time striking, I also think we are going to see some takedowns and some top control. So that is leaning me over to the Ferreira side. So for those reasons, I'm picking Diego Ferreira to win this fight. And in the next fight, this low-key is a very, very fun fight, and I think a lot of people are sleeping on it. We've got Maheshate versus Viacheslav Borshchev. Now, what makes this fight really good is the fact that both fighters are dangerous strikers. They've both got knockout power. They both love to exchange on the feet, and they both really, well, at least I don't think they like to face fighters that are wanting to take them down and get them on the back and be relentless with that wrestling and topside control. Both fighters are predominant strikers, and therefore both fighters are going to get the fight that they want here. So it's going to be a really interesting fight. It's going to be a fun fight. I think we're going to see some hard shots. I think both fighters, like I say, are just going to take the opportunity just to enjoy the fight against one another, knowing that at least pre-fight that the opponent isn't going to want to take him down unless one of these fighters has been working on that sneaky game plan of shooting a takedown and being relentless and having their opponent not expecting it because they're both predominant strikers. Look, I think it's a good fight. I think it's a fight that is going to play out on the feet, is going to have the better moments, the bigger action moments on the feet. And I do think both fighters are going to have the moments for sure. But for me, I feel like Borshchev's just a better put together striker. Now, if you're looking at a fighter that's likely to shoot a takedown, again, I don't know. I really don't know. Like, for me, if I was looking at Viacheslav Borshchev as an opponent from Maheshate's side, I might think to myself, look, let's try and mix in the wrestling. Let's really start getting him thinking about, the strikes that he's throwing. Because if Maheshate is literally attacking only with the striking, I think it plays into Borshchev's game perfectly. If Maheshate starts feinting some takedowns or just shooting some takedowns just to get Borshchev thinking, that's going to allow Borshchev's striking to decline a little bit, which might give Maheshate the opportunities to then start really letting go of strikes himself and then building towards that win. But like I said, unless I've seen that in tape previously, I can't assume it's going to happen here. I can only go from what I've seen in tape. And I think that Borshchev, like I said, is the better put together striker. I think he's got slightly more power, deceptive power. I think he mixes things up more, especially with the kicks as well, whereas Maheshate does seem to be more boxing heavy. And I think Borshchev just has more variety in the attack. I think he has slightly more power. From a speed aspect, I think that'll go to Maheshate, which that will add an interesting dynamic to the fight. But Borshchev is a very intelligent striker, so even if he does have a speed disadvantage here, he'll just be able to make the reads to be able to adjust to that speed disadvantage, maybe turn it into some of the strikes into a bit of a counter game where he's just allowing Maheshate to come first and then halting that speed with just a good hard shot to the leg, maybe something along those sort of lines. I just think Borshchev, like I said, is the better put together striker. I think he's got more variety in his strikes, from the boxing to the kickboxing. I think he's got slightly more power. He'll attack to slightly more areas as well. And in a fight that, like I say, between two predominant strikers, that is more than likely going to be won and lost on the feet, it's hard to side away from that fighter. For those reasons, I'm picking Viacheslav Borshchev to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Karolina Kowalkiewicz versus Vanessa Demopoulos. Now, it's an interesting fight, this, because we've got a fighter that's seemingly starting to make the way up the division in Vanessa Demopoulos. She's won a couple of fights, and now she's rightfully looking at someone like Karolina Kowalkiewicz, who has been around for years, been in the cage with some of the best. She's had the championship fights, and I think it's a really good fight. Now, one thing just to mention from Kowalkiewicz's perspective is, a couple of years ago, she was on this heavy decline. Everybody thought, okay, well, she's been up there and now she's on her way down. And for a while, seemingly, I think she went on a 4-fight losing streak. And for a while, it just seemed like she just lost it. And I don't know, I can't remember whether she retired initially and then came back, but it just seemed like she completely lost it. But now, low-key, she's put back-to-back wins together, including a finish, and she's looking like she's got something about her still. And look, I've made this argument before with some of these women in the UFC, because the divisions are slightly smaller in regards to the numbers of fighters in them. So a fighter like Karolina Kowalkiewicz, for years and years, has only fought the best opponents, and she's only been beaten by the very best in the division. So it's one of them where, when you're that type of fighter that's only losing against the best, and then you take a step down in competition, you can start putting wins back together. And I kind of feel like this is the same type of thing with Vanessa Demopoulos. I'm not taking anything away from what Demopoulos has been doing inside the cage, and she has been improving, and she has, found a finish herself inside the cage, inside the UFC, which is always difficult for the new fighters coming in. But Karolina Kowalkiewicz, she's more experienced. She's had more time fighting against the very best women in the world. And I think that Demopoulos will have her moments in this fight. But from a striking perspective, I think that Kowalkiewicz is a better striker. Maybe more output, but just a better quality of strikes put together inside the cage. More variety mixing in with the kicks as well. From the wrestling perspective, I think this is where Demopoulos should be able to get at Kowalkiewicz if she is relentless enough with the wrestling. But if the fight does get down to the mat, I'm not sure how long Demopoulos can stay on top. Kowalkiewicz has got a decent get-up game. She should be able to get back up to her feet. So, although the wrestling might be slightly in the favour of Demopoulos. I like the get-up game of Kowalkiewicz. I also like the striking game of Kowalkiewicz. You add in the experience and the fact that she's only fought the best women in the world, and it's only the best women that beat her as well. I do think I'm struggling to side with Demopoulos in this fight, just because, like I said, I think that at this level, Kowalkiewicz has still got something to give. If we throw her up there with the top 5 again, then for sure I think she gets beat. But right now, in this spot, against this level of competition, I think it's a well-deserved step up for Demopoulos. I think it's a step up where she's going to show some good moments as well, but it might just be a little bit too much too soon for Demopoulos. For those reasons, I'm picking Karolina Kowalkiewicz to win this fight. And in the next fight, this could be a firefight as well. You know, we've got Orion Cosce versus Gilbert Urbina. So it's nice to see Gilbert Urbina back in the UFC in regards to being back on a card. I'm not sure he ever left, but it's been a while since we've seen him. I think he's been dealing with injuries. But look, it's good to see an Urbina in the UFC. You know, we've seen that many of them in the Ultimate Fighter. They're a big family of fighters. And Orion Cosce, I think, is actually not a terrible opponent for Gilbert Urbina. Like, I think the UFC could have given Gilbert Urbina somebody much tougher that's going to, you know, really make life difficult for him. But with Orion Cosce, I feel like his style, Urbina's going to have moments where he can win this fight, and I think that's really clever matchmaking. Cosce is, you know, like his brother, they're heavy-handed, they're aggressive. The cardio is a big question mark in both of them, but they do have a good wrestling base as well. They're good fighters. Both the Cosce brothers are. So, Orion Cosce for me, look, there's no shame in losing to Phil Rowe. But on the same token, I don't feel that, and again, I don't mean any disrespect with this, but beating Blood Diamond on a decision I don't think is the greatest fight to be shouting about either. What I do know is both of these fighters are going to be game to stand and strike with each other. I think if there's wrestling, then Cosce, that could be a real good fight IQ type of moment for Cosce, with a good game plan for him to actually get in at the hips of Urbina and try to take him down. Because on the feet, I do think the fight is won and lost on the feet, by the way, and I wouldn't be shocked to see a wrestling heavy approach from Cosce, but I just don't think he's going to be able to sustain a heavy wrestling approach for 3 rounds, especially if Urbina is providing some comeback and some defense in regards to that, you know, the anti-wrestling. So for me, I do think the bigger moments are going to be on the feet. I think Urbina's going to have moments to hit Cosce and hurt him, but I do think Cosce is going to be the slightly more athletic fighter, potentially the faster striker, and if he's not the faster striker, he's definitely going to have the power upside as well. So I think that Cosce is very dangerous on the feet, but I do think he's got the ability to mix things up as well. So if there is a close round and he shoots a takedown with 30 seconds left and has some good top control time, that's going to be enough for a judge to sway them over to Cosce's side within that close round. But I do think it's going to be 2 fighters that are going to be looking to try and take each other out, make a big statement, make a knockout, create an opportunity to get a knockout and really put the UFC on notice. And I genuinely do think that'll be the mindset of both fighters, because both fighters have been a little underwhelming so far in the UFC and probably do need to make that statement to the UFC to say, look, I'm here, here's a big knockout, and I'm on the show type of performance. So yeah, look, I think both fighters are going to be game here, but I am going to be siding with the fighter that I think hits harder in a fight that could be a bit of a slugfest, but also has that level change wrestling available just to really slow things down or just sneak a round that's potentially close already. So for those reasons, I'm picking Orion Cosce to win this fight. And in the next fight, I'm not sure if the fight or the bout order, is going to change, but I've got no idea why this is so low down. We've got Ilir Latifi versus Rodrigo Nascimento in the UFC heavyweight division. And it's an interesting fight, this stylistically, because Ilir Latifi's got really good wrestling. He wins the majority of his fights via wrestling. He's not via striking. His output is super low to the point where it's, you know, probably one of the lowest outputs in the UFC, actually. Like, he really doesn't throw too much at all. And that's over a large sample size of fighting for years and years in the UFC and, you know, fighting many times as well. So Ilir Latifi, he's really not going to be in a fight where he wins and loses too often from a striking perspective. So he definitely looks for the wrestling, the takedowns, and his top side control is okay. You know, it's more heavy though than technical in regards to the jiu-jitsu. So if he does fight somebody that, you know, is capable from a jiu-jitsu perspective, then they might be able to get back up to the feet. If they're not, then he can lay on them. And to be honest with you, it all depends on how urgent that opponent is as well. Like, you look at Alexei Oleinik. Oleinik had the jiu-jitsu to get back up. He just didn't want to stand with Ilir Latifi, it seemed. He was happy to lay on his back and look for submissions and try and stall things out. I'm really not sure what was going through Oleinik's head, because he was genuinely the better grappler, and if he wanted to get back up, I think he could have done. Now, obviously, it is more difficult for these heavyweights to get off the back once they're on the back, so it will take a good jiu-jitsu player. But then this is where in comes Rodrigo Nascimento, because Nascimento is a good jiu-jitsu player. Now, can he get taken down? I think Latifi probably can take him down, yeah. But although we haven't seen a massive amount of Nascimento on his back, he was hurt by Alan Bordeaux and ended up on his back after being hurt. And Bordeaux tried to get on top of him, and Nascimento, even hurt, he was straight back on a hip, got back up to his feet and carried on. So I do think a non-hurt Nascimento, so for example, if Latifi just takes him down, I think he'll be able to get back up to his feet. I don't envisage Latifi being able to lay there for minutes and minutes and minutes across the 3 rounds on top of a good BJJ player like Nascimento, without Nascimento being able to get back up to his feet or sweep and reverse him. And this is the other thing. Look, Ilir Latifi's got 100% takedown defense. He's never been taken down. But if Rodrigo Nascimento can get Latifi down and Nascimento's on top of him, I really don't see Ilir Latifi having the jiu-jitsu to get back up to his feet, if I'm being honest. And look, Nascimento does have decent takedowns as well. So again, there's a few unknowns in regards to that aspect of the fight. But from a striking perspective, Nascimento still has some holes in my opinion, but he's also a striker that is getting better, that is putting things together a little bit better. I also think he's had good moments against better strikers and more active strikers than Ilir Latifi, who tends to throw only 1 or 2 punches at a time. So look, I think that Nascimento is going to be the better striker here. From a wrestling perspective, that goes to Latifi, but then that adds a little bit of danger for Latifi, with Nascimento being the better BJJ player. So with Nascimento being the better striker and the better grappler, with being the better grappler, sort of Latifi's style plays into that as well. I am leaning towards the fighter with more paths to victory. I think if it's won and lost on the feet, Nascimento will be the better striker. If it's won and lost on the mat, you have to think that it's Nascimento's world on the mat as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Rodrigo Nascimento to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Chase Hooper versus Nick Fiore. And this is an interesting fight because I'm not sure how many more opportunities Chase Hooper's going to have. And I kind of feel like, look, this is no disrespect to Fiore, because I actually don't know enough about him yet, and I actually think he's a good fighter. And spoiler alert, I am actually picking him to win this fight. But I kind of feel like the UFC are feeling like, okay, Chase, here's Nick Fiore. He's a fighter that's only had 1 fight in the UFC. You know, you fell short a couple of times against some more experienced guys. Here's the fight that you need to go out there and win. So I think in the UFC's mind, they're seeing Nick Fiore as that fighter for Chase Hooper to get a win and, you know, start that rise at the top again. Like, Chase Hooper is a very likeable guy, and there's a lot to like about his game, but the developments just don't seem to be there with Hooper and his striking. And this is where I think he's going to have a problem in this fight, because Nick Fiore is predominantly a grappler and he's a very good grappler. So I don't think Chase Hooper is going to have a massive amount of success against Fiore. Even if he gets on top of him, I think that Nick Fiore is comfortable enough to be able to defend the submissions and maybe even get back up to his feet. Then when you're looking at the cardio, is that going to really wear Chase Hooper down, constantly shooting takedowns after takedown? And we have seen that before as well. So I think Fiore's probably got the better cardio. And then when you look at the striking, again, I haven't seen enough of Nick Fiore to be like overly confident here. But Nick Fiore trains, I believe, with the New England Cartel, head coach Tyson Chartier, training partners Calvin Cater and Rob Font. So Nick Fiore's striking has got to be getting better at a significant rate, even though he's predominantly a grappler. So I actually think that Fiore is going to be a difficult fight for Chase Hooper. I don't think Chase Hooper is going to have the type of performance that the UFC think that he might have here. I think it's a difficult fight for him stylistically. Look, it's going to be a close fight, and it wouldn't shock me if Hooper got on top of Nick Fiore and it turned out Hooper's jiu-jitsu was that much better. But Nick Fiore is a good grappler. He's a black belt in jiu-jitsu himself, and he's got decent striking and good cardio against a fighter that I think has got very lackluster striking, not great cardio, but a good grappling game. You know, Chase Hooper's a specialist, and if that specialist aspect within the jiu-jitsu and the grappling comes through and gets him the win, nobody should be surprised. But like I said, and I've spoiled it already within the breakdown, I'm going to be siding with the fighter that I think is more well-rounded here and has the defense in the one area that the specialist needs the defense to be a little bit lower. So for those reasons, I'm picking Nick Fiore to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Victoria Leonardo versus Natalia Silva. Natalia Silva is, I think, the biggest favourite that we've seen on a fight night for a very, very long time here. She's a minus 1,000 favourite, a 10-1 favourite to win this fight at one of the books, with Victoria Leonardo being plus 700, a 7-1 underdog. So there's obviously a reason for that. I mean, I don't think the line should be that wide, if I'm being honest. I think it's gone crazy, and it definitely didn't open at around minus 1,000. So people are laying big chalk on Natalia Silva here. She's obviously going to be in a lot of parlays, and it's dangerous. Look, we've seen it happen before at this level within women's MMA. It was Shanna Dobson versus Maria Agapova. Obviously, Shanna Dobson was a huge underdog in that fight, and every man and his dog were betting the opposite way, and obviously she came out and won. So, look, there are risks, but Natalia Silva is a good fighter, and she's well-rounded as well. She's got good movement, she's a good striker, she's got decent takedowns, she's got a good grappling game as well. And I think that Victoria Leonardo is going to be significantly slower here. And I think that when you're matching the disciplines up between both women, I think Natalia Silva is going to be the better striker. I think she's going to be the better wrestler. I think she's going to be the better grappler. Victoria Leonardo does have decent trips as well, just like Silva, and she does have a decent ground game, but I just don't see Victoria Leonardo being able to get in on the takedowns. And I mentioned it very briefly earlier on in this podcast. I think that if Leonardo does come into this fight wanting to get a hold of Silva, look, she's not going to be shooting open mat takedowns. She's not going to be shooting out in space. She's going to need to get close, clinch up, wear on Silva and then trip her down to the mat. But when Victoria Leonardo comes in, I think that Silva's going to be that much faster and sharper with the striking, that Leonardo's forward pressure is just going to be halted pretty much at all times. And then when you add in the speed and the movement advantages of Silva, I think it's going to be very difficult for Leonardo to get this fight to where she's going to be most comfortable, which is on top of Silva. And outside of being on top of Silva, I think that Leonardo, like I've already mentioned, she's at a significant striking disadvantage, speed disadvantage, movement disadvantage. And if Silva can get on top of Leonardo, then I think that she can do good work there as well. So I do genuinely think that, look, Silva's a big favourite. I don't think she should be a minus 1,000 favourite. I think that's crazy. But again, you've got to ask yourself the question, why is she minus 1,000? And that's because she is that much better than Victoria Leonardo in every aspect, and Victoria Leonardo's path to victory is likely just going to get shut down and nullified by Silva from, the opening bell. So, look, I would never recommend laying down minus 1,000 on Natalia Silva in this type of spot, but I am very confident that she does get the win. So for those reasons, I'm picking Natalia Silva to win this fight. And the last fight to break down on this card, and again, I'm not sure why this fight's so low down. I'm not saying it should be like a main card fight, but I definitely don't think it should be the opening fight. We've got Takashi Sato versus Themba Gorimbo. Now, it's a real stylistic clash here. We've got Takashi Sato that's absolutely a striker. Then we've got Gorimbo, who does prefer to wrestle and grapple. And Sato hates fighting the fighters that want to wrestle and grapple. Sato prefers to be having an opponent in front of him that wants to stand and strike with him. And Gorimbo, I just don't think is going to give Sato that fight. In the same token, though, I think that Gorimbo's striking definitely needs some work. I do think he is going to be developing, though, and that is an interesting aspect to take into this fight. Like, for me, Sato's going to be the better striker, and I think the longer Gorimbo stands with Sato, the more he's going to get hit, and Sato does have deceptive power, so if he knocked Gorimbo out on the feet, I wouldn't be surprised, especially with one of Gorimbo's previous fights as well, where he's just winging big bombs at his opponent. There's no technique behind it. He's not in control of the strikes. He's just winging them out and being ultra aggressive, and it's that type of striking that is a means to the takedown for Gorimbo. But at the same time, if you do that against a good defensive striker and a good counter striker like Sato, then you're going to be in big trouble and you're going to get knocked out. But the thing is, with Gorimbo, we've seen other moments where he is technical. So maybe that was just a fight where, I don't know, he maybe lost his head a little bit. He maybe saw something or didn't respect the striking coming back from his opponent. And that's what led to him being reckless. I don't think he's going to have that that type of striking against Sato. He can't, because if he does, he is going to get knocked out. But I think that once Garimbo does start mixing things up inside the cage, once he starts shooting in at Sato, I actually think he's going to have to work hard here, Garimbo, if he wants to win. I think that Sato is probably going to defend the first couple of takedowns, or if he does get taken down, I think he might be able to spring back up to his feet within that initial scramble on the takedown. But I do think Garimbo can go into relentless mode here. We've seen it before, and when he does go into relentless mode, he does normally do a good job of taking his opponents down and then just being able to smother them topside. I think from Garimbo's last fight where he lost against Fletcher, I think stylistically Fletcher was a much more difficult fight than what Sato is in this fight. I think that Sato can be got at with the takedown, so I do think Garimbo's going to be able to get takedowns here. And even from Sato's perspective, and look, this surprised me a little bit, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but I'm just talking facts here. From a fighter that's a specialist in the striking department, because like I said, Sato is predominantly a striker, he gets hit more than he lands on his opponent. So for your specialist area to be in the striking and you're getting outstruck on average by your opponents, it's not a good look. I think that Sato is going to have opportunities here to knock Garimbo out, but I think if Garimbo can just mind his P's and Q's, get in on the takedowns and just be relentless with that type of game plan, I think he's going to succeed against Sato. So for those reasons, I'm picking Themba Garimbo to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast. We're on a week break next week, so there will not be a podcast next week. We do have a break from the UFC, which I think is probably due. I think we've had about 10 plus events in a row. So yeah, I'll be back in a couple of weeks with the next breakdown for the next event, which looks like a good one as well, actually. I'm looking forward to really getting into the tape of that. But from this podcast perspective, this episode, look, I appreciate everybody that tunes in. You know, the channel, in my opinion, I wish that more people would tune in, the numbers would get better, but over time I'm sure that will grow. The things that do help is like the video, you know, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment down as well. That helps the YouTube algorithms. Obviously, if you are listening to this on YouTube, if you're not and you're listening to this on one of our podcast platforms like Spotify, like Apple Music, Amazon Music, if you can take a moment just to like whatever you can and get over onto YouTube and subscribe to the channel as well, that would be greatly appreciated. And like I said, if you're betting, and like I always say, if you are betting on this event, I hope you crush the bookies. If we disagree on any of the picks, on any of the predictions, let me know which ones. I do try and get back to every single comment, and it is me that personally replies to the comments as well. So yeah, enjoy the events on Saturday night, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks after the 1 week break for another breakdown.